Thank you for that very kind, very generous introduction. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of this webinar for putting together such a lovely panel. Uh, I begin by paying my respect to late Professor Eileen Pereira, whose intellectual contribution to the field of Southeast Asian studies has been immense. My institute, the Asia Europe Institute at the University of Malaya, had the honor to have late Professor Eileen as a visiting professor for several years, and we miss her very much. It's really indeed a pleasure to share the panel with Professor Pham, Professor Changchi Quick, and of course, Dr. Irfa, a friend from my IDSA days. So I'm really delighted to be a part of this webinar. It's more a sort of get together virtually, though, a get together for me at the intellectual front. Uh, the topic I've chosen today for my presentation is Indonesia's response to great power politics. And great power politics is something that has been the predominant factor shaping the international relations of Southeast Asia. There are no two views about that. Uh, this is also not a new phenomenon. The Southeast Asian region has been a witness or victim, if you will, of the great power politics during the Cold War years, particularly, but even before that, during the imperial era. Uh, the great power politics shaped the Southeast Asian region, and we are fully aware of how back during the colonial times, the imperial powers just decided amongst themselves as to who is going to rule where. So distribution of colonies was also uh, a factor there. And this has had a huge impression on our perception of history, our perception of international relations, and our perception of how world politics functions. Even the term Southeast Asia is not one of our choosing, uh, which speaks volumes about the domination of the West in shaping the IR and foreign policy discourse in the non-Western world in general, and Southeast Asia in particular. This perception of great power politics, the idea uh, that we have to steer clear of superpower binaries, the bipolar mechanism, one that was there during the Cold War years and the one that is now unfortunately emerging, has been this idea that we have to steer clear of it, has been one of the guiding philosophies of Southeast Asian foreign policies. And we see that despite Americans trying very hard and at least to some countries, strong security challenges emanating from China. Despite that, we see that the Southeast Asian region is not homogeneous in terms of its response. The IC's Yusuf Isaac Center, Professor Ronaldo mentioned that the surveys, of course, have their own limitations, and in research methodology, we often refer to something called biases. So a universally acceptable definition of uh, framing questions, or the bunch of questions that you are asking, is also important there. But I leave that aside. I think to a great extent to the questions that were asked were fine. But if we do a broad survey of Southeast Asian foreign policies and the responses of the 10 Southeast Asian countries on the ongoing China-US rivalry, Indonesia stands out on a number of counts. Well, there are several countries which have their own unique responses. For example, Vietnam, or Malaysia for that matter, at least on the economic trade investment part. But Indonesia stands out on a number of counts. In comparison to the Philippines or Thailand, which have traditionally been very close to the US, or Myanmar and Cambodia, which are considered closer to China than any other superpower, Indonesia's position has been different. It has tried to play an active role and made efforts to go beyond being a passive recipient in the international system. If I can use the IR terminology, a rule maker rather than a rule taker is something that has always driven Indonesia's foreign policy aspirations. Of course, this is mostly in the regional context, rule making and rule taking in the regional context. And also, this has come with its own limitations. There are several important reasons behind that, and I'll talk about those aspects briefly, and also assess 5 key developments in the region which are directly related to great power competition in the Southeast Asian region. My first point is that unlike several other countries in the Southeast Asian region, Indonesia has tried to play a proactive role in finding a way out, creating something new, uh, uh, and playing a proactive role in shaping its foreign policy orientations. For example, uh, the global maritime fulcrum. Now, there are 5 principles of this global maritime fulcrum. If you ask a foreign policy expert or an IR expert, he would say, well, those features are natural. I mean, those are geographic determinants of Indonesia's foreign policy, but trying to come up with something new. So Jokowi's maritime fulcrum, you know, 1,000 friends, 0 enemies are some of the examples. Even historically, Indonesia's leading role in shaping the non-alignment movement during the Cold War years, its participation in the Indo-Pacific, in the Asian Relations Conference, the Bandung Conference, are important. And recently, the Indo-Pacific Treaty, trying to come up with a treaty-based Indo-Pacific construct, was something that I thought uh, uh, has been Indonesia's major contribution. So Indonesia has tried to stay ahead of the curve when it comes to the ASEAN region and its approach on great power politics, especially in the Southeast Asian theater. The other important feature of the Indonesian foreign policy is what the Indonesian scholars term as independent foreign policy, meaning that Indonesia will pursue its foreign policy without getting under pressure from any major or middle power or any regional group, including ASEAN. I think a better term here is strategic autonomy. And that strategic autonomy is clearly manifested in Indonesia's response to uh, the US-China competition. Indonesia is more or less equidistant. I know Indonesians don't like this term equidistant, but Indonesia is equidistant to both the US and China at this moment, which is not the case with a number of Southeast Asian countries. Bilaterally, almost all of them have closer partnerships with either of the major powers, either of the superpowers. This insistence on strategic autonomy, I believe, is a distinctive feature of the Indonesian foreign policy. And it has also been the biggest contributor in shaping Indonesia's tactical response, termed as hedging in IR theory. Now, I dare not speak more about hedging and how Southeast Asian countries respond to that, because Dr. Cheng Chui is here, who is popularly known as Mr. Hedging in Malaysian and the regional foreign policy circle. I think he'd throw more light on hedging and Southeast Asian response um, in his presentation. The other important aspect of Indonesian foreign policy at the regional level is its firm belief that it is the primus inter pares in the Southeast Asian region, the first among equals. Indonesia's role in shaping the ASEAN response to the 2021 Myanmar coup is a classic example there. I'll not discuss that in detail in the interest of time, but perhaps during the Q&A, we can talk more about that. Now, let us come to the key developments of strategic importance and see how Indonesia has responded to that. And I have listed 5 key strategic developments. Strategic not just in terms of military strategy, but also in terms of overall long-term perspective of foreign policies and also in economic aspects. So the first, Indo-Pacific. Second, you've got the Quadrilateral Security Alliance, or the Quad. Third, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, the South China Sea dispute, and fifth, regional issues, at this moment, the Myanmar crisis. So let us see how Indonesia has responded to these 5 key developments that are also of strategic development, strategic importance. On the Indo-Pacific construct, I think there is no doubt that Indonesia was the first country in the Southeast Asian region to talk about Indo-Pacific construct. And it even, as I mentioned earlier, it even went to the extent of proposing an Indo-Pacific treaty. Of course, there were no takers of this treaty proposal in the Southeast Asian region, leave alone major powers. But this proposal was different from the Indo-Pacific concept as propounded by Japan, India, Australia, and the US. Indonesia started talking about this treaty in 2013-14. And that was the time when even the US, now termed as the principal proponent of Indo-Pacific, was really not clear as to how to go about it. And Japan, then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had mentioned that, but the roadmap was not really clear. Now, one is not privy to official details, but it seems clear that Indonesian proposal was a standalone proposal. It was certainly not guided by the US or Japan. I think there is also broad consensus on the point that the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific could take shape largely due to Indonesian efforts. Of course, other leading powers in Southeast Asia played their role. And at the end of the day, it has to be consensus-based. But Indonesia certainly took the lead. Even though I feel that the ASEAN outlook is more ambivalent than it should be, ASEAN's role in the emerging Indo-Pacific order has been what is termed by scholars as a tempering agent. So ASEAN working as a tempering agent in this great power politics in the emerging Indo-Pacific order, where China has its own position, which stands in contrast with the US. So the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific served Indonesian foreign policy on two counts. First, it strengthened Indonesia's idea of pursuing an independent foreign policy or strategic autonomy, and opened a strategic window, not just for Indonesia, but also for the wider ASEAN region. So that tomorrow, if things do not work very well with China, at least the ASEAN members could then move toward the US and its partners using the Indo-Pacific construct. But at the same time, AOIP in its current form is accommodative enough to include Chinese interests. So it talks about regions and parameters that are already set, and it doesn't advocate something new. And that's very important. Maintaining the status quo is very important in these times of high volatility in the regional and international order. The second important move taken by the US and its partners is the Quadrilateral Security Alliance, or the Quad. The Indonesian response so far, not very surprisingly, has been measured. And I do not think that there would be any drastic turnaround soon. A lot of scholars talk about this possibility of a Quad plus. I don't see that feasible anytime soon. And there are a number of reasons for that. We can perhaps discuss that later. Quad plus to me is not possible at this moment for any of the Southeast Asian countries. Having said that, it is also clear that Indonesia today is more engaged than ever with the Quad countries. And this engagement is more at the minilateral, trilateral level than Quad as a unit. So keeping the strategic option open without formally endorsing a strategic club is something that Indonesia is doing at this moment, and it is doing that beautifully. I think the other country which is doing it almost perfectly is Vietnam. Professor Pham, I'm sure, would talk about that more, how Vietnam has engaged Japan and India, the US more comprehensively over the past 5 to 7 years. The third important initiative is, of course, China's Belt and Road. All of us know that BRI was earlier termed as the One Belt, One Road initiative, indicating that there is the maritime arm, the maritime Silk Road, and the land arm, which is the Silk Road Economic Belt. Now, it was no coincidence that the maritime arm of the Belt and Road Initiative was launched in Indonesia by Chinese President Xi Jinping. So basically, even for China, Indonesia is perceived as a good catch. It is not just the US which is interested in engaging Indonesia more. China has been equally interested. So I'm sure if you ask the Chinese foreign policy makers now, the Chinese MOFA now, they would want to travel back in time and shift the launch to some other country. Not because the Indonesia-China relations are not good, but purely because Indonesia hasn't easily accepted the terms and conditions set by China. It has always been it has always insisted on its, maximizing its interest and negotiating terms of deals. This again is different from how BRI is implemented in, let's say, in Malaysia or in Myanmar. In case of Malaysia, we did have reviews and reassessments, but in the end, most of the halted projects were reinstated. In case of Indonesia, it has been a bumpy road. And I think there, the role of Japan has also been important. It has played an important role. The fourth aspect is the South China Sea dispute. We know that Indonesia is not a direct party to the South China Sea dispute. And if you leave China aside, Indonesia should not be having any major territorial problem with the fellow Southeast Asian countries that are claimant to Paracels and Spratly Islands. And yet, the Indonesian response to China's 9-dash line or air naval intrusion in the Indonesian waters were not taken very kindly. And this applies equally to other Southeast Asian claimants. Indonesia has, I would argue that Indonesia has been feisty in its response to intrusions and illegal fishing episodes. We are aware of the incidents where boats, etc., of fishermen were simply burnt. They're just burnt down. So I feel that Indonesia's response, even on South China Sea dispute, is not constrained by the ASEAN response. It looks at things differently. And now I think this response to South China Sea dispute is also more in tune with its strategic autonomy, independent and active foreign policy than limiting itself or capping its foreign policy choices because of the fear of one or the other party. I'll not get into the details of how Southeast Asia's other powers look at Indonesia's South China Sea policy. That can perhaps be a matter of debate for another webinar. The South China Sea episode has also encouraged Indonesia to initiate a number of mini-lateral dialogues, as I mentioned earlier, with friendly countries. So there I see a remarkable similarity with Vietnam. Even though Vietnam has not gone in for mini-laterals, unlike Indonesia. In case of Indonesia, we see India, Indonesia, Australia trilateral dialogue. There's a possibility of Indonesia, Japan getting into a trilateral dialogue with India. Australia is also pitching for it. So over the past few years, this has emerged as a prominent feature, and Japan has emerged as an important partner of Indonesia. The fact that Japanese Prime Minister Suga Yoshihide's first trip as Prime Minister was to Indonesia and Vietnam speaks volumes about Japan-Indonesia partnership. The possibility of that further elevating to mini-laterals, trilaterals, and also indicating that Indonesia is shedding inhibitions in engaging the US and its partners, which would give it more strategic maneuvering space in the long run. Here, I think we must not forget how Indonesia has been using the Japan-China infrastructure competition to its advantage. Something that I think Dr. Chang Chui would speak in more detail. I don't know if that has been a successful strategy or not, but certainly an indication of how Indonesia perceives itself. I know that I'm running short of time, so I'll wind up quickly. The fifth and last point about Indonesia's self-perception, as I mentioned earlier, is seeing itself as primus inter pares. The ongoing Myanmar crisis, which has struck ASEAN hard. And in this moment of regional policy paralysis, I hope I'm not sounding too harsh on ASEAN, but regional policy paralysis, Indonesia came to ASEAN's rescue. There is a broad consensus on the fact that the dialogue process could take off primarily because Indonesia's leading role, assisted, of course, by Malaysia and Singapore. The flurry of visits that took place to Brunei and to Malaysia, to Singapore, and of course, involving Indonesia has been prominent. Indonesia has played a key role in keeping ASEAN active and relevant. And that also has a prominent role to play in steering the regional grouping clear of any great power politics, not getting directly involved. Indonesia has had success in the past, and that perhaps tempts it to play a major role, acting this primus inter pares responsibility. The Pre-Vihar temple dispute, or even the year when Cambodia could not release a joint statement as ASEAN chair. Those years, particularly when Marty Natalegawa was there as the foreign minister, things were pretty good there. But one also must admit that sometimes these efforts have failed to yield a substantive outcome. Now that ASEAN has not been able to do much in dealing with the Myanmar crisis, there are points that there are arguments that perhaps a joint effort by major powers could have yielded better results. Which brings me to my last and final point, which is that in pursuance of its independent and active foreign policy, in tune with self-perceived role of primus inter pares, Indonesia has sometimes punched above its weight. Economic capacity shortfalls have also affected Indonesia's performance. Indonesia often lags behind other ASEAN powers such as Malaysia and Singapore, not to forget Vietnam, which has emerged as the fastest growing economic hub in the region. So when it comes to economic performance or per capita income, for example, or even in terms of free trade agreements, whether RCEP or FTA with the European Union, the CPTPP, Indonesia is not seen at the forefront. So while on the strategic front, Indonesia plays an active role on the US-China trade war, it is conspicuously absent. And Vietnam, Thailand, and Singapore have more important role to play there in terms of shifting away these industries, the companies, the American companies to the Southeast Asian region. So this gap in diplomatic strategic intentions on one hand, and capacity shortfall, especially on the economic part, have capped Indonesia's performance, which oftentimes leads Indonesia to pursue hedging vis-a-vis China. So because of its underperformance on the economic front, those policies, as I mentioned earlier, independent, active, strategic autonomy, primus inter pares, all of that falls short because of economic underperformance. And that perhaps leads Indonesia to behave the way it does. I'll stop there and welcome questions and comments, if any.